with Horace, right? I mean, one of the things that's striking about him is that he's the poet laureate of the Aetas Aurea, the golden age of Rome. That is of Augustan Rome, the pinnacle of Roman civilization, the era of the Pax Romana, right? So we could say that not everything was perfect in Rome or the provinces during this time, but the Pax Romana was a pretty good thing that Augustus accomplished. So Horace was the poet laureate, and that's significant because he's a contemporary with Virgil. And everybody reads, probably in high school, the Aeneid still. Probably fewer people read Horace unless you're studying Latin, but he was in fact the poet laureate. They were both in a coterie of poets who were supported by Augustus Caesar's right-hand man, Maecenas. Many of Horace's poems are dedicated to Maecenas. And it's also striking the upward mobility that he found. So he was born not in abject poverty, but he was the son of a freed man. So his father had been a slave and was freed and sacrificed a great deal so that Horace would be educated. And that would mean, rhetoric, philosophy, these sorts of things. And Horace was in Greece, as I recall, studying at the time of the Great Civil War, right, with Octavian and Brutus and Mark Antony, and Horace made the very poor choice of siding with Brutus, and fought in Brutus's army, and was at the decisive rout at Philippi, where he says that he abandoned his shield, which would be a tremendously shameful thing for an ancient warrior to do. It's doubtful whether or not that happened, because there's a similar poem by Alcaeus, the 6th century BC contemporary of Sappho, in which he talks about losing his shield, and Alcaeus is very much an influence on Horace. So we don't know if he's just sort of imitating, a poet who was, several centuries older, whom he admired, or if he actually left his shield and fled. In any case, somehow he ends up in the good graces of Augustus, who, against whom he had been fighting. So this is, it's quite striking. And Maecenas buys him a beautiful villa in the countryside in Tuscany, and he's really the great chronicler of what the spirit of that age was. We see in Horace elements of Stoicism. We see elements of, so I want to use this word properly. So, do you know Lucretius, the De Rerum
I know of
Natura?
Lucretius.
Right. Yeah, the nature of things.
Atomism.
Right, and Epicureanism. Now, that's the
Right.
word I want to use particularly, because when you say Epicurean to contemporaries, they think it's like just boozing, and and that was not it at all. The idea of Epicureanism was to live a good life, and a good life meant, following Aristotle, to be virtuous, right? Now, you might imbibe some wine, but you wanted to have moderation. Horace is the champion and the coiner of the Aurea Mediocritas, the golden mean. So the idea was to live a good life. So we see Epicureanism, we see Stoicism, we see a love of the pastoral, and we see also in his satires the sort of follies that people were wont to fall into at the time. So he's a great chronicler of the spirit of the age. We have from historians something of the kind of material reality. Sorry, I'm going to be cattywampus because I have to plug in this computer.
Okay.
We have from historians something of the material aspect, but Horace gives us the spirit more nearly than any other poet of the time. So yeah, that is a sort of introduction to who Horace was. And as I recall, you wanted to look at the famous Ode 111. Is that right?
Yeah, we had a few, and a lot of them deal with this very, very common ancient theme of death and, sort of count no man happy until he is dead. That's that sort of thing. And so the first we had listed a couple, 4 that we might look at, and 3 of those 4 deal with that. But yeah, we can start with 111.
Yeah,
and if you'd like to read any of these in Latin, that would be great.
So yeah,
any that you see fit.
This is the shortest of them. So I will do this in Latin. So it's 8 lines. These are 16 syllable lines, and the characteristic of the meter, this thing to think about with the meter, is that the dominant foot is the choriambus, which is long, short, short, long. So there are 3 choriams in a row in the middle of every line. There are 2 syllables before, 2 after. So it's 2 syllables, choriam, 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 2 syllables in each line. So Horace is a proponent of balance. That's characteristic of him. So he only uses this meter 3 times. It's this poem, I believe it's Ode 118 and maybe Ode 4:8. And in each case, so in this, it's 16 syllables per line, 8 lines in the poem. In 118, it's 16 syllables per line, 16 lines in the poem. In 4:8, it's 16 syllables a line, 8 lines in a poem. So there's this kind of mathematical balance and shapeliness to them. Now, one of the things that's tricky with classical Latin meter is that in English meter, we replace a long syllable with emphasis or stress. And in a Latin meter, stress or emphasis has nothing to do with short or long. That has to do with the vowel qualities. So it can be a little tricky. But here's Ode 111. Tune quae Sirius, scire nefas, quem mihi, quem tibi finem dederint, luconovi, nec Babylonius temptaris numerus. Ut melius quicquid erit, pati, seu pluris hiemis, seu tribuit Jupiter ultimam, quae nunc oppositis debilitat pumicibus moro terrenum. Sapiens, vina liquis, et spatio brevis pim longam resicis. Dum loquimur, fugerit in vidaetas, carpe diem, quam minimum credula postero. So that choriambus that I mentioned, long, short, short, long, carpe diem is a perfect choriambus. Right? Now we don't hear it because we're used to the stress. We say diem, right? But stress and the long have nothing to do with it. So it's a perfect choriam, which is one of the reasons why it's meaningful. In any case, I would mention that carpe diem, when one is translating that ode, one runs into a difficulty. Everybody knows carpe diem means seize the day, except it doesn't mean seize the day. Carpe in Latin is not seize at all. Carpe is, well, we have the root carpals, metacarpals in our fingers, right? And the figure here is that spem or hope is like grapevines. Now, if we're plucking a grape, if you seize a grape, you have crushed the grape. So
right.
Seize is a poor translation. It's more at pluck the grape, but pluck the grape doesn't sound as good in English. You could also say harvest.
Pluck the day.
You could say harvest, pluck the day. You could say harvest the day. And that actually is a choriam in terms of stress. Harvest the day, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, stress, right? That would be our approximation of it. But if you write harvest the day in your translation, then your readers are not going to know that this poem, this ode from Horace, is the origin of the famous phrase carpe diem. So you're sort of obliged to lose, as I said, you're going to lose something. So if you write seize the day, they'll say, oh, this is where it's from. But you've also sort of missed the figure. So here's my translation, which I would note is one of the few. This meter is so rare in Horace. As I say, it's only used 3 times. And normally my translations are line for line. So if there are 8 lines in Horace, there's 8 lines in Wilson's version. But a 16-syllable line in English would be an octometer, which just doesn't sound like a line at all.
Right.
So I broke from using line for line, and here wrote a sonnet in heroic couplets. There are 128 syllables in Horace's poem. There are 138 with mine because I lopped 2 off with acephalic lines. So it ends up being about syllable for syllable, even though I've added 6 lines. So here's my version of Ode 111. You shouldn't ask. To know is devilry. What end the gods have given you and me, Luconoe. Nor should you fix your hopes on anything you find in horoscopes. Better, whatever comes, the suffering. Whether Jupiter is judged he'll bring us future winters, or that this shall be our last, which now whips the Etruscan sea crashing against the cliffs. Be circumspect. Purify the wine, and, if you detect vines overreaching their allotted spaces, trim them. Even as we talk, time races by begrudgingly. Seize the day, and trust tomorrow little as you may.
Now, I don't have much Latin, but when you were reading the Latin, did I catch, did he say Babylonian numbers?
Yes.
Which you translated as horoscope. So that's part of what the translator has to do, not just translate the words, but also things that people won't maybe understand as readily.
That's right. Babylonian numbers are the tables used in astrology for horoscopes. But as a translator, first you're going to be hamstrung by the word numbers if you try to rhyme it. You're going to have encumbers, slumbers, cucumbers.
Right.
And you're sort of out of it. And none of those show up in this. You could do something with encumber, but anyway, if you put Babylonian number, people are, well, what is that? And of course, in Horace's time, they understood that Babylonios numeros were astrology charts, basically.
Right.
So yeah, you have to update that, or you don't have to. I did here for the sake of being or practicing Xenia toward my readers to be a good host for my readers, so that it's a pleasurable thing. That's the goal. I mean, for Horace, pleasure is primary. So yeah, you want your odes to be pleasurable. You don't want them to be tedious.
It's interesting where he starts with this idea of not trying to know the future. But then as a consequence of that, embracing the suffering or at least accepting the suffering of the present time. And part of the suffering, because he doesn't actually specify too much what the suffering is other than the uncertainty itself.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, no, that's it. And it brings up perfectly the distinction between the classical mind and the romantic mind. We talked about the romantic mind as being a perpetual seeker. Right. And, so I mentioned Ulysses, whom Dante puts in the Inferno because he's perpetually seeking. He had no reverence. He had no sophrosity, no circumspection. He wanted to exalt himself with this perpetual seeking. Well, the Romantics love that. Right. We have in Tennyson's Ulysses, as I say, a sort of locus classicus of that, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. We see almost a translation out of Dante in Stéphane Mallarmé's poem Brice Marine. The speaker there sounds just like Ulysses in the Inferno, except for he's talking French. Nothing's going to hold him back, not even his pregnant wife. Nothing will hold him back. He's going to go on this journey into nature, a la somebody like Gauguin. So there's this constant seeking for the romantic spirit. The classical spirit said, well, we don't know. And just sort of make yourself okay with not knowing, right? That circumspection was paramount. Sophrosity, know your limits. Don't transgress. Anybody that tries to transgress on the hidden knowledge normally gets zapped with a thunderbolt.
One thing that I really liked in this poem, and I have no idea if it was intentional or not, and I normally don't even pay close enough attention to notice these things, but in the line crashing against the cliffs, well, I'll begin the sentence. The Etruscan sea crashing against the cliffs, be circumspect. And you've got that hard C alliteration. And then circumspect, you've got this, it transitions from crashing against the cliff to this soft C and S sound. I don't know if was that intentional at all?
Well, yeah, as Pope says famously in the essay on criticism, true ease in writing comes from art, not chance, as those move easiest who have learned to dance. It is not
Hmm.
enough, no harshness give offense, the sound must seem an echo to the sense. So certainly in that line, the hard C's, I'm trying to get something at a crashing sound, something at cacophony,
Right.
right? And also with the short vowel sounds, the ash, right?
Yeah.
It's not terribly euphonious. I'm trying to make it sound unpleasant to
Right.
embody the sense. And then circumspect, well, that goes back to what I was saying. I mean, it's sort of the spirit of Horace is circumspection.
Right.
And it's much more gentle, right? Once that period
Right.
ends, we modulate into a bit of gentle advice. And so it needs to sound avuncular and calm, not violent in the way that the Etruscan sea crashing against the cliff sounds.
Now, purifying the wine,
Yeah.
I don't know much about what this actually would have entailed in ancient Rome. What is that actually? What would they actually be doing there?
Well, so you've got your grapes. You have trod on the grapes. Now you have a bunch of wine or potential wine after it ferments, but there's also a bunch of grape skins. You don't want a bunch
Mhm.
of grape skins in your wine, so you purify it. You would strain it. It would basically be a version of a colander, right?
I see.
And the idea here, right? If our days are like grapes, as they are in the figure, our days are like grapes. What we want to do is to refine them, purify them, get
Right.
rid of the dross, get rid of the ugliness and the nastiness, and just have a pure, lovely wine. Make our days enchanting. That's the idea. So
Now, when he
it's not
says,
YOLO, right? It's not the young people. I don't know if 10 years ago they said YOLO, which is a sort of
yeah,
seizing of the day, this violent, let's just go be crazy.
right.
It's not that at all for Horace. It's let's purify. Let's make this lovely. Let's make our days beautiful.
But when he says if you detect vines overreaching their allotted spaces, trim them, is that an Epicurean thing of we're going to have the most refined pleasure in these days, or is he at all looking forward? He says, "Trust tomorrow little as you may," but is he at all looking forward to? Is there anything of virtue there? Is he looking forward to a next life, or is it more stoic? And he's not thinking about that at all.
Well, so I go with a literal term here, where Horace uses an abstraction. He dives right into the figure. His word is spem, which is hope. Hopes
Mm-hmm.
are overreaching their allotted spaces, but I wanted to keep the figure, and I think that readers can sort of intuit based on, well, if a vine's overreaching, what would that be? When anything's getting out of bounds, when anything is getting out of control, get control of it, right? So it's about self-possession and not being carried away. So it's really Epicureanism in the classical sense of it, which is enjoy your life, but don't get carried away. Don't lose your mind. Don't destroy yourself.
But is there any sense of preparing to make a good
No,
death, or is it really just about enjoying the days
yeah,
in the most seemly way?
yeah. There's not in this poem any sense of making a good death. I think for Horace, a happy death would be to conk out while he's talking with Maecenas and Virgil over some wine. You know,
Hmm.
yeah, that element of spirituality is not there in Horace, even in the way that it is in Virgil. He sort of has a mock conversion in one of the odes, but it's not serious. He wanted to have the virtue of kairos or timeliness, to be present here now,
Hmm.
It's a very dangerous thing when we start thinking about the future too much. Foresight can be quite dangerous. In fact, in Greek, foresight is Prometheus, right? That's what
Right.
Prometheus means,
Right.
forethought, really, right?
Yeah.
It's dangerous. You're playing with fire when you start thinking about tomorrow. Instead of, as they say in the Psalms, age quod agis, do what you're doing. Vir liter age, et confortetur cor tuum, et expectu Domine. Do what you're doing. Make strong your heart and wait on the Lord. Um, that's what David encourages. And of
Right.
course, there are limits to everything. We do need to have some thought, obviously, for eternity. But when that becomes your primary concern, I think you can forget to live here. And Horace wants us to live here very much.
Um, what sense are we to take the genre of an ode? How specific of a term is that?
Yeah, so there are a few types of odes. The two dominant uh, types of odes would be the Pindaric from the I want to say 5th century Greek poet Pindar, who wrote public poems. They're celebrations. So after the Pythian Games or the Olympic Games, he would write a poem celebrating the champion. Right, so it was designed to be very public, to be read in public, and often these are in mixed meters. So when you're looking at an ode from Keats, something like the Ode on the Grecian Urn, he is imitating in the mixed meter of the stanza the Pindaric ode, right? On the other hand, he's not doing everything Pindar was doing because, again, Pindar's odes were intended to be entirely public. Like, here's a crowd, you're going to say, you know, Usain Bolt has won the 100 meters. Here's 100 lines extolling his glories and tying him to mythological figures. That's sort of the mode of Pindar.
Right.
The other major type of ode, I would say, is the Horatian, which is all of Horace's odes are addressed to individuals. So it's not a public performance. They are epistolary in nature. To a great extent, right? They're all addressed to one individual, one specific person, and sometimes it's a real person like Maecenas. Sometimes it's a made-up person like Luconoe here is just a fictional character so far as we know. But it allows for a more intimate speech, and often the meters are irregular just because of the stanzas that he chooses. But in a poem like this, the meter is quite regular. So it's not like the Pindaric ode at all. It's much more intimate. It's more private and much shorter, easier to understand, easier to appreciate, and there's far less of the recherche in Horace than there is in Pindar. It's so difficult to translate Pindar because there's so many allusions to just random stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And in Horace, it tends to be quite avuncular. There are wisdom statements, there's lovely description, so they're much more accessible, and that's part of the reason he's been so beloved for a couple of millennia.
Does that name Luconoe signify anything?
Well, little Luke would point at whiteness, but I don't think there's anything in Greek, right? I mean, if we're translating from Greek, Luke, but I mean, it's just, it could be, well, Noe could be from nous, from mind, like bright-minded could be something like that, which would make sense. Someone who has a bright mind would want to know the future. A real Latin scholar would know that. I don't. I'm just going to have to speculate.
Okay, so let's move on to the next couple of odes, which we don't have to discuss in as much detail, but
Sure.
They're thematically similar. Can we do 210?
Sure. Yeah. Rectius vives. So this is an ode in the Sapphic strophe, named obviously for Sappho, the great love poet of antiquity, from the Isle of Lesbos. Our word lesbian comes from her. On the Isle of
Right.
Lesbos in the 6th century, it was very common for female teachers and their female students to be involved in amorous affairs.
Hmm.
So Sappho was so beloved and so famous in antiquity that she was named the 10th muse. That's what they called her. There are the 9
Mm.
muses, all the children of Mnemosyne that
Wow.
govern all the arts and sciences. So they sort of made her a demigoddess, making her the 10th muse. She was so beloved. We only have fragments and maybe a couple of whole poems from Sappho. Um, and in Latin, her presence really first shows up with Catullus, who is he's maybe 20 years older than Horace. And Catullus, in his Carmina, or poem 51, translates Sappho, the fragment we now number is 31, and so brought the Sapphic strophe into Latin. And Horace extended that and wrote, I think, the second most common form for Horace's odes is the Sapphic strophe. So importing a
Mm.
Greek form into Latin. And the Sapphic strophe, not to go in too much into meter, I would say it's a quatrain. There are 4 lines in every stanza. The first 3 lines have 11 syllables. The 4th line, called the Adonic, has 5. Um, so bringing it into English, you want to create something like that effect. So what I do is an iambic pentameter for the first 3 lines with 10 syllables, and then the 4th line has 6 normally. So it's an approximation of the original form. Yeah, here's 210. A better life's not always making for the deeps, Lysanias, nor is it found cringing with dread when tempests come around and clinging to the shore. Whoever loves the golden mean will shun the squalors of the low, forgotten houses, and also shun the palace that arouses envy in everyone. The tall pines shake most when the high winds shriek. Huge towers come down with the loudest crash, and frequently the lightning's sudden flash strikes on the highest peak. The well-made heart hopes on the bleakest day, fears on the brightest, that his fate somehow may change. Jove brings back hideous winter now, and now takes it away again. If things are bad now, they will not be so forever. Sometimes Apollo's lyre wakes up the silent muse, and his hand tires of stretching his bow taut. Show yourself a man of spirit. Hail when times are hard, and when it's billowing and puffed out from the jolly winds that sing, wisely trim your sail.
What can you tell me about this phrase, the well-made heart?
Well, it's a bit of phrase making. Uh, yeah, for Horace, there's, as I was mentioning, there's this idea of uh, making one's life beautiful, uh, and of self-control, right? Circumspection, what the Greeks called sophrosiny. Uh, so, yeah, I took some liberties with the Latin to get the well-made heart, but it's more or less accurate to the spirit of the thing.
And who's the silent muse here? Apollo's lyre wakes up the silent muse.
Yeah. So uh, Apollo is generally thought of as the god of poetry. However, we learn, especially lyric poetry, he plays the lyre, from which we get the word lyric. Um, he gets the lyre, however, from Hermes, Mercury. In the Homeric hymn to Mercury, we find that Mercury makes the lyre out of a tortoise shell. And then because he's always mischievous, Hermes, Mercury, is also the god of thieves.
Right.
So he steals Apollo's cows, and Apollo gets mad and goes to Jove and says, "Daddy, somebody stole my cows." And so as a sort of rapprochement, they trade, and Hermes gives Apollo the
Right.
lyre, and so he becomes the god of poetry. So the muse here is any muse, right? That Apollo is often a very violent god, right? The sunbeams are often described as arrows, as in Book One of the Iliad, right? Where in a hapax legomenon, Apollo is given the vocative epithet of sminthu. A hapax legomenon is a word that occurs only once in an entire language. So, of all the Greek that we have, the only instance of sminthu is in Iliad 1, where it describes Apollo. It's the mouse god or rat god, scholars think. But he was the god of plagues, right? If you'll recall, the plague that besets the Argives is from Apollo. He was a vengeful god. He was a violent god. But he had this sort of leisurely aspect too, where he's the god of poems, right? And so the idea is that sometimes Apollo quits shooting his arrows at us and killing us. And sometimes he just relaxes and plays the lyre. And which muse that would be? Well, Erato would be the muse of lyric poetry. So presumably Erato. Yeah.
Can we go ahead and read 214?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the ode to Postume. I took his name out. He's sort of a fictional character anyway. And I inserted my friend for a few reasons, which we can talk about later. Yeah, okay. Ode 214. Ah, no. The years, my friend, they slip away. And nothing, despite all our prayers, can save us from the coming days, wrinkled and gray old age, and the inevitable grave. Slaughter, with each new day that comes around, 300 oxen to the tearless king who keeps Gerion's 3 huge bodies bound, to Tyres too, beyond the sorrowing river which is for all who taste the sweet fruits of the earth to cross when life is done. Princes or paupers, farmers in the wheat. You'll still be Pluto's, as will everyone. In vain we flee the blood-stained battlefield, the wild-flung waves on the hoarse, storm-rough sea. In vain hope autumn's southern winds will yield and spare our trembling bodies injury. You must seek out the slow and aimless murk of coiled Cocytus, and all who descend from Danaus, and watch the wasted work Sisyphus, the oldest child, does, without end. You must forsake the earth, your home, the wife you love. Of all the trees you tended to, doting, the gluttonous cypress, after life, brief gardener, alone will follow you. Your best son carelessly will slosh the wine you guarded with 100 locks, and pour that precious vintage pontiffs, when they dine, might find divine on an exalted floor.
That last stanza is one of my favorites in the book on a musical level. It's just delightful.
Well, thank you.
And I've also been texting it to my friends who have small sons.
Well, I'm glad you can dishearten all of your friends. What am I for if not that? Yeah, I mean, and it's also, Thomas, this is an example of what I was talking about in terms of syntax. That when said aloud, the stanza sounds perfectly like speech, I think, or approximately enough to give the illusion of it. But reading it, there's some syntactic liberties that are taking place there. Right. And pour that precious vintage witch pontiffs, when they are dining, might find, right? So there's all these sort of elisions in the syntax. There's another example in that long second sentence, right? We talked about how you can create a line with an illusory syntax that has a vertical meaning in addition to the literal linear meaning. So line 5, slaughter with each new day that comes around. That's the theme. Right.
I liked how you just began the second stanza with slaughter.
Yes. right? And
It's like, whoa, ah,
that line on its own is the theme of the poem, and we don't realize because of the hyperbaton that it is slaughter 300 oxen, right? The direct object is slaughter oxen with the implied subject you, but we just have slaughter with each new day that comes around as a syntactical unit on its own is quite handsome and to the point, right, of the poem, even though it's also doing this linear thing as the sentence progresses. So, yeah, there are a lot of syntactical sort of hijinks in this poem to get it to work. The sorrowing beyond the sorrowing, right? Well, the sorrowing is modifying
right,
river, right? It's describing the Acheron or the Styx, right? In the underworld beyond that river, but you get beyond the sorrowing. Well, the life is filled with sorrow because there's slaughter with each new day that comes around. So you get all these little bits, and then the river, which is for all who taste the sweet fruits of the earth to cross. That long dependent clause, which is for all who taste the sweet fruits of the earth, river to cross. So yeah, it's a way of and you can't capture what Horace is doing, but you can create an approximation of some of the
right.
handsomeness of the individual line within the context of the linear motion of the sentence from line to line.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of references in here. I don't want to get bogged down explaining them all.
Yeah.
The cypress. I googled the cypress,
Yeah.
and apparently it's a short-lived tree. So that's how I took that
Well,
line.
and just in antiquity, it was associated with the funerary.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was just common, and I'm sure that has to do with it being short-lived, just with the origin of
Yeah.
the ancient rituals. But here, yeah, it
So
was
he
just
says,
yeah, it
of
was,
all the trees you tended to, doting, the gluttonous cypress, after life, brief gardener, alone will follow you. That's
yeah,
the line that we're referring to. Now, a pontiff is not a pope in this poem.
correct.
It is a emperor, I guess, or maybe
A
is it
prince.
broader than that?
You could say
A prince,
yeah,
yeah.
a prince, something like that. Yeah.
It really is interesting when you look closely at these poems about death and fate in Horace. There's this attention, there's this awareness of death, and yet without any real sense of escaping the vanity of this life, which is what it would be easier at first reading to mistake it for something closer to a Christian sense, or even some other classical perspective, like a Socratic sense or something. But I don't think that that's what it is.
No. Yeah, there's no metempsychosis in Horace. We are not passing through and returning as in Plato. It really is, as I say. I mean, it's very much out of Epicurus. The idea of we're made of atoms. We break apart, and so we have this miracle that we are here now, and let us live pleasurable, happy lives while we can. That's very much Horace.
But in this last poem we're going to look at by Horace, he exempts himself a little bit from this universal law. Ode 220.
Yes, indeed. So
quite different from the previous ones.
Yeah. So this is it's not one of his best poems. It's maybe one of his best known because it's so unusual. So this is a poem that is in the Alcaic strophe. I mentioned Alcaeus earlier as the guy who also left his shield. So the most common meter that Horace uses is the Alcaic strophe, which is the form that Alcaeus invented. Alcaeus is a contemporary of Sappho, also from the Isle of Lesbos, over near what was then Troy, what is still the Bosphorus, modern day Turkey. So the Alcaic is, the first two lines are like the first two lines of a Sapphic strophe. It's the 11 syllable thing. Then the third line is 9 syllables and the fourth is 10. I translate it just as a pentameter quatrain rhymed A-B-A-B. So I say it's the most common form in Horace. But one of the important things that's happening here, Horace is very proud of himself for bringing these Greek forms into Latin poetry. And so there are multiple levels of transformation happening. There is, in this poem, Horace is going to turn into a swan.
Hmm.
And that transformation is bolstered by his transformation of a Greek form into a Latin poem. Right, so that he's having a bit of fun here with the idea of transformation. So this is Ode 220, which is I think inferior to Ode 330. They are both sort of valedictory. They seem like they should be the end, and they are the end of their respective books of odes. Ode 220. No, no weak wing, no customary wing will bear me through the liquid air. A biform poet. I'm done dilly-dallying on earth, flown far beyond the jealous eye of cities. No, I, whom you call your friend, Maecenas, I, with all the pauper's blood my parents gave me, I will never end, or be imprisoned by the Stygian flood. Already, rough, my legs feel wrinkly skin take hold, and white, I'm turned into a swan on my top half, and downy, growing in my fingers and my shoulders, plumes come on. More famous now than Icarus, that child of Daedalus. Where Bosphorus coasts moan, I'll fly, a tuneful bird. And through the wild deserts and Hyperborean plains unknown, they'll learn the Colchian and the Dacian who pretends our Roman armies stir no fear. They'll learn my name. Scythians will hear it too. Spaniards and drinkers of the Rhone will hear. Don't give my hollow funeral a dirge, or your base lamentations, or your gloom. Spare the wake's clamor. Don't let honor splurge on the vacuity that is a tomb.
So I have a little a poetry discussion group going on via Zoom. And by the way, for listeners, we need more people. So if you're interested in taking part, feel free to contact me, and I'll be glad to invite you. But we're reading Ben Jonson right now, and we just read Ben Jonson's tribute to Shakespeare, and I couldn't help but see, as I did with a number of poems in this book, actually, in the last stanza, something where I think that he says, Shakespeare, you are a monument without a tomb. I couldn't help but see that referring to this last stanza here, where he says, don't let honor splurge on the vacuity that is a tomb. Do you think that's a direct influence there?
100%. 100%. Ben Jonson's hero was Horace. He knew Horace in and out.
Yeah.
He translated Horace. He called himself Horace in one of his plays called The Poetaster. He loved Horace.
Wow.
Definitely. And
Okay.
that stanza is imported in several other famous poems from English. Alexander Pope, I quoted earlier. When he was 11 years old, he wrote an immortal poem called The Ode on Solitude. And the last stanza of that is derived from the last stanza of this. It becomes sort of a common motif in the Renaissance through the 18th century, of the poet becoming immortal through his poetry.
Well, it's interesting. I did notice this a bunch of times throughout this collection. You mentioned another Horace poem, which we won't read. In the introduction, you mentioned Epode 2, that being an influence on Penshurst, which I just read last week. And then there's another one, one of the ancient Greek poems, the Anacreontia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, towards the beginning of the book. There's one, and I thought, wow, this is a hilarious poem that I've read by Abraham Cooley.
Yep. Indeed.
Called On Drinking. Or Drinking. And I think Cooley might improve on the the original a little bit. It's a little more expanded. It's quite funny. But that was an interesting aspect of this book as well. Just the way that poets had clearly picked up on things. And the Petrarch, I think there was a Petrarchan example of that too, with Whoso Lists to Hunt by Wyatt.
Yep. Good. And this is what this book is for. There's so many, all these poems, almost all, especially the older ones, I included these specific ones largely because they will help any reader of English poetry to navigate Yeah, with the Anacreontia, yeah, Cooley turned poems from that. So did Richard Lovelace, another cavalier of that period. So did Robert Herrick. So did Goethe and Byron. Thomas More, not the saint, the Irish lovelorn poet.
Two O's.
Yeah, Thomas More with two O's had a bestseller in the early 19th century with the Anacreontia. They were very famous. In fact, they
Hmm.
were so famous. The Anacreontia was so famous, and Anacreon was so famous uh, that there was a drinking club in Old England called the Anacreontic Club, and they had a club cheer, as all those old clubs had, and you might recognize the melody. Bum 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 bum
Oh,
bum. Our national anthem is set to the melody of the Anacreontic Club's drinking cheer.
wow.
So yeah, all this stuff comes back, right? It all comes back. And one of the things that I hope with this book is that will, as I say, help readers who may not have Latin or Greek or whatever it is to see these influences in English language poetry. So there's a Ronsard poem, Ronsard and the Pléiades in 16th century France. They were also big into the Anacreontia, but one of the Ronsard poems in here that I include begins, "When you were very old, working your wool, candlelit evenings by the fire." And if you know W.B. Yeats' early poems from the 1890s, he has one that is based on the Ronsard, "When you are
Hmm.
old." So yeah, most of these will have cross references in famous English poems. Many of them, I think, I've linked in, or not linked, but put into the notes. Maybe not always, but yeah, that is one of the ambitions I have with the book.
What's the mythic significance of Horace turning into a swan specifically? Is it that that's the idea of the swan song?
Right. So there's the strange myth about the swan singing as it dies. The only
Hmm.
time the swan sings is as it dies. And so we talked about the transformation of him into a swan, of Greek into Latin, but it's also of life into death and of death into life, right? As he's
Hmm.
going to die, but his death will be immortal. He will be like the swan. He will be known everywhere because his poems are so good. And, remarkably, Thomas, he called his shot. Let's see, Horace died November 27th, I think, of 8 BC. So what is that?
Hmm.
2030 years ago almost, and here we are talking Horace. Pretty close to immortality.
Hmm.
Not of course in the Christian or Catholic sense, but 2,000 years, pretty good.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention about this poem. In the third stanza, you were mentioning this device of hyperbaton,
Mm-hmm.
and I again, I don't know Latin really, but I was struck by these interjected adjectives and knowing a little bit of Latin and the word order and stuff. Is that a pretty exact replication of the Latin word order, or is it the exact replication of the way that it sometimes works anyway? Where let me read the stanza. It's already rough. My legs feel wrinkly skin take hold, and white. I'm turned into a swan on my top half, and downy, growing in my fingers and my shoulders. Plumes come in. So there's those three adjectives that are sort of stuck in there in a way that's different from English, normal English syntax.
Yes, and so in the original, there's a sense of discovery as the stanza is moving. I mean, this is the stanza of transformation, and so there's a sense
Hmm.
in the syntax of sort of discovering and being bewildered and a little off kilter. And you can't capture Horace's word order, but I tried to get something of that effect, as if he's sort of looking down and saying, "Oh, I have downiness on my fingers," right? To get this sense of sort of performative transformation. It's why I think many critics, and especially great classical scholars find this to be an inferior poem. There's something a little bit pathetic or performative about that stanza and about becoming a swan on the page. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I tried to capture, sort of the effect of the original, which is often, what one has to do with Horace, because you simply can't imitate the word order. So you try to create something that is an approximation of the effect.
There is something of desperation to the to the poem.